Hello and welcome to this opening exploration video featuring the Sicilian Kalashnikov variation. So I had a request by a viewer to talk about the Sicilian, do some videos on that. I used to play the Sicilian for a long time, for years. I kind of went to the Carol just because it's probably safer. The Sicilian can get a little crazy. So let's dive into this Sicilian Kalashnikov variation, which is what you see on the board here. So to begin with, let's go back and see how you would reach this position. So the Sicilian begins with E4 by white and then C5 by black. So this is the Sicilian defense. If any beginners are not familiar with it, it's a good counter-attacking opening for black. There are probably less draws than other black openings. It's a good attacking opening. So what does white do here? And well, first of all, what is black doing? Okay, a lot of times in the chess opening, white will try and place both pawns in the center on d4 and e4. So black is just playing c5 here to cover that d4 square, so you can capture a more valuable central pawn with the less valuable flank pawn here on c5. So white, their most often played move by far, 656,000 games, is their most played move, with knight to f3 next, followed by knight to c3. But we're just going to cover one area, one variation of the Sicilian. There's a lot of transpositions in the Sicilian, and the Sicilian can be kind of complicated. So maybe, that's another reason I kind of migrated to the Carol. But if you like attacking games and you're not afraid of a lot of opening theory, let's explore further here. So knight f3 is played to cover these central squares and prepare this push of the d pawn to the center. And black has different options here, but since we're going to the Kalashnikov variation, I'll play into that. Black can play a6, e6, d6, but what we're going to look at is this move, knight to c6, which covers e5 here. It also helps cover the d4 square. And speaking of that d4 square, white usually pushes forward here. Now, they don't have to, but that is, I believe, the most played move, yes, by quite a bit. Another option is to push the bishop to b5. Knight to c3 can be played. So white has different options, but we're going for the main lines here, just to familiarize you with them. Since this is an introduction, I'll try not to go into too many sidelines. So d4 is what white will usually play, just fighting immediately in the center and trying to take control of the center with these two pawns. So black, by far, 106,000 times in this database, black is just captured in the center. Because if black does not capture, well then, white, for one option, can push this pawn to d5, attacking the knight, chasing that knight away, gaining space. Also, a lot of times in the Sicilian, one of the main goals by black is to push the d pawn to d5. And of course that wouldn't be possible if white pushes their pawn there first. So normally black just captures, pretty much forcing white to recapture to keep the material even. Capturing with the knight, of course, not the queen, because now knight is attacking knight here. And to get to the Kalashnikov, now here there are different moves that can be played. If black plays this knight to f6 move, immediately attacking the pawn, well then white would probably be forced to play knight to c3 here just to defend. So the Kalashnikov is this move right here. Now it can go into this Lowenthal variation, but once you push forward, I mean, what should the knight do here? If the knight just retreats back, well, you've kind of lessened the scope of that knight, pushing it back and retreating. You're keeping an eye on the pawn on e5, but the knight is in a worse position than it was here in the center. So the best move here, if you want to try and get an advantage as white, is to just push forward here to b5. Now there's a threat of jumping in here, forking the king and the bishop. And, if that happens, probably the best move is to just go ahead and knock that knight out of there. Then the queen would recapture. And white has gotten rid of a knight that was placed in enemy territory, but in exchange for that, he gets rid of black's bishop pair. So normally, and this is, going into the Kalashnikov variation now. So after this move, normally d6 would be played, and that's the most commonly played move. So you just push forward here, preventing this knight from being able to jump to d6 now, or capture this pawn, because now the bishop is covering that square along with the queen. So we have two attackers and two defenders. So black is okay at the moment. So now we have the Kalashnikov variation. And the two main options here, now you have to watch out. If you play knight to c3, well, you could go into, transpose into another variation, the Sveshnikov, I believe. But since we're not doing that video on that, the Kalashnikov often will play the second most played move, c4. And they're pretty close, almost 4,000 times versus almost 5,000 times. So most often played is bringing the knight up to c3 because you develop a piece, you protect this pawn. But one thing that move does is block our c pawn. So in this video, I'm going to talk about this move, pushing the c pawn here. And this is what is known as the Maroczy bind, where both the c pawn and the e pawn cover this important d5 square. And as I mentioned, an important goal for the Sicilian defense for black is to push that d pawn up to d5. And what would that move do? Well, it kind of gives black more space. Because this pawn is on d6, the position is a little bit cramped for black. It blocks in their dark squared bishop, and white has more space here by keeping that pawn back on d6. So after this c4 move, we get kind of a lockdown on this d5 square, and there'll be a battle over that d5 square. So the most played move here, it looks like, is bishop to e7, just developing the bishop first. You could play a6 here and immediately chase the knight back. So this is where you kind of have to play the Sicilian, get used to the different little nuances and variations and transpositions, because what happens a lot of time in the Sicilian is that you can kind of go back and forth between different openings. So there's a lot to know in the Sicilian, and that's another reason that I kind of switched over to the Caro-Kann, because there was just a lot to keep track of in the Sicilian. But if that doesn't intimidate you and you're not afraid of the different variations and transpositions, then by all means, try out the Sicilian. Feel free to leave comments and let me know how you do with the Sicilian, what you think of it. As always, I enjoy hearing from viewers and subscribers, and also like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Okay, so we play this move. Something I want to show you is this knight to f6 move, which is kind of at the bottom here. It looks like white wins a good percentage, 42%, although it looks like 51% of the time white wins if this a6 move is played, chasing the knight. But before we go further, I just want to show you this possibility. So if knight to f6 is played, there are different options. Now, of course, black is immediately attacking the knight here. So the most commonly played move is knight up to c3. So we'll play that. And now it looks like a6 is played most often. So if they attack our knight, we have to retreat back. And now bishop to e7 is played most often. But the reason I wanted to talk about this knight to f6 move is, let's say the second most played move is initiated here, the bishop. Well, white has different options. They can play bishop to e2, knight to c2 can be played. But I want to look at this move, because now we've pinned the knight to the queen. So, the most common move here is to break this pin. But then we see the top move is to go ahead and give up your bishop pair by capturing here. So we capture. They capture with the bishop to avoid breaking up their pawns on the king side and creating weaknesses. So now, what do? Well, we could play bishop to e2 and get ready to castle on the king side. Knight to c2 can also be played to get this knight that was on the edge of the board back into the center. And then now, let's see. We have rook to c8 being a common move, trying to add pressure down this half open c file, lining up on this pawn along with the bishop. So bishop to e2, white is ready to castle. And now what? It looks like knight to d4 can be played. But what I wanted to talk about is that black, by allowing you to capture their knight that was on f6, that gets rid of an important defender of this d5 square, and it makes it easier for you to jump a knight in here. So, they bring their knight in here, creating an attack here now with two pieces on that. So knight to e3 takes care of that problem, but more importantly, it gets ready to bring one of these knights up to this great outpost, and now there's only one attacker, this bishop, and the knight is no longer here to help cover this d5 square. So play will revolve around this hole in black's position, and it looks like castling is usually played here by both sides. And now what? g6, which allows the bishop to retreat back into this fianchettoed position. Rook to c1, getting ready to fight on this half open c file, also to defend the c pawn. And so anyway, I don't want to get too deep into this. This is just one way the game may play out, and most of the game will revolve around this d5 square now. So after, I could play it out a few more moves. Bishop to g7, the knight jumps into the center, and now what? We have an attack on the pawn here, and looks like the number one move is just to go ahead and capture here. So capture, capture, and there's also a threat of pushing forward, attacking our knight. So f4 is the most played move. Bishop captures, knight captures, and what next? Capture of the pawn, knight recaptures, and that's why the knight captured, because, well, I guess the queen could capture this as well. So queen takes instead of the knight, because we develop a piece, and if the knight would have captured, that would have lessened the power of that knight. So queen to b6 with a check. Also, the queen is now protecting this pawn because we kind of have a fork here. So that's something to watch out. A lot of times in the Sicilian, you have to be careful of the knight moving to b6 here, targeting the pawns on the queen side and delivering a check at the same time if white's king is castled on the king side. So the king runs into the corner. We have rook attacking the queen. So you get the idea. Now let me go back. We'll go back all the way to the beginning so I can show you once again how we could go into the Kalashnikov variation of the Sicilian. So e4, c5, we have the Sicilian. The knight develops to allow you to push the d pawn forward. So if the knight is developed, and this is one of the main moves in the Sicilian for black. They can play other moves, so I suggest if you're going to play the Sicilian, just play a lot of games in the Sicilian opening, with white or black, and just see what the different variations are. But moving on to the Kalashnikov, we push forward in the center. This is the open Sicilian. They normally capture, we recapture, and now we have this e5 move immediately attacking the knight. But as we saw, that leaves a hole here on d6. And the best way for white to try and get an advantage is the number one move, knight to b5. And that usually leads to d6 being played. Now, as I mentioned, another option would be to just attack that knight, but it would jump into the center and you would exchange bishop for knight. The queen would recapture, and black's position is a little bit cramped with the queen there, so the queen would probably move to f6, attacking. But that is, I believe, the Lowenthal variation. Now we want to go into the Kalashnikov. So d6 is played, and now we're going into the Kalashnikov variation. Now I mentioned that the number one move here is to bring the other knight out, but that would block the c pawn. So you'll have to figure out, if you're going to play against the Sicilian with the white pieces, what you want to do here. If you prefer just developing the knight or pushing this c pawn, as I mentioned, which is the number two move, creating this Maroczy bind. And if we go back and look, what does white win more often with? Well, it looks like bishop to e3, moving here. White has the most wins at 43%, so that could be something you might want to try. But between the number one and number two moves, white wins a little bit more often with the c4 pawn push, pushing this pawn up. So we'll take another look at that at the main line, since I kind of veered off. Now, c4, this is the Maroczy bind, as I mentioned, and it kind of binds up black's position, preventing them from pushing to d5 and opening their position to give their pieces more breathing room. It just locks down the center. So the number one move, we looked at bringing this knight out, which is actually, the least played moves out of these, top 5 possibilities. So the number 1 move, bishop to e7. What does this do? Well, it creates a battery. The bishop could land here on g5 and try and force white to trade off their good bishop for black's bad bishop. All right. Knight develops here, and I believe that was the number 1 response. Yes, knight at 1 to c3, so you just develop the other knight. And there's a possibility of jumping up to this outpost, putting some pressure on the bishop. Also maybe attacking, trying to trade off a knight, possibly. But let's see what happens here. The number 1 move now is a6. So immediately chasing that knight out of there, because there's also the threat of jumping the other knight up here, and both knights would be aiming at this c7 square, threatening a fork of king and rook. So black normally just immediately kicks this knight back to a3, an awful square for this knight at the moment. But that knight will re-enter the game. First, let's look at black's number 1 response, and that is bishop to e6 here. So what does this move accomplish? Well, it develops another piece. It helps control the center, specifically this very important d5 square, so that if the knight jumps in there immediately, it can be knocked out of there. And something else I should remember, and maybe it'll come up here as we go through these variations. If your knight jumps up to d5 on the outpost and the bishop captures, you have options. You could capture with the queen, you could capture with the c pawn or the e pawn. Generally, you want to leave this half open file open, for your pieces, your rook and queen, to try and put pressure up here on this backwards d6 pawn, and black will have to defend that throughout the game. So, normally you probably don't want to capture with these pawns if you don't have to. I mean, you can do that. So let's see what the main moves are. It looks like after bishop to e6, we have an immediate knight to c2 being played most often. So bringing that knight back towards the center, you're covering this square to prevent the knight from jumping there at the moment, but also you could reposition up here and have both knights prepared to jump into this outpost square. So the number 1 move here is bishop to g5, trying to trade this bad bishop for white's good bishop, perhaps. And normally that's just ignored with bishop to e2. But the second most played move is just to capture immediately. But that would just help the queen develop. So why not develop a piece of your own? And here we have black's number 1 move being to follow through with the plan of trading off the bishops. But of course that helps white develop their rook onto this half open file, where it can help guard this pawn on c4, which is usually attacked by rook to c8 and the bishop here. So, this is a common move for black to bring their rook to c8. All right, so now knight to f6 is usually played, and we no longer have the bishop, that was able to possibly try and pin the knight to the queen. Although, if the bishop was there, that wouldn't be possible. But, they could try and attack and trade off the bishop for the knight, but that's no longer something that can be done. So what is the most played move here? It looks like castling, and then black usually castles as well. So we're going, deep into the middle game here, and let's see how this normally plays out. So now the queens need to be developed. So queen up to d2 here, keeping an eye on d4, d5, and the d6 pawn. So queen to b6. So here, this move does multiple things. It attacks the unprotected pawn here. It lines up on the king, pinning this f pawn. What else is happening here? The queen is helping cover d4. You know, in case in the future this knight may want to jump forward. At the moment, that's not possible, or you know, it's not so good because the knight could capture if the pawn captures. Oh well, let's take a look at this. I guess it is possible at the moment because we have two attackers of this square, and well, let's see. If they would jump, we would capture, pawn captures, and the queen could not take because it's protected and the knight would be chased away. But let's look, you know, before I spin off into some crazy variations, let's just look at what the most played moves are. So here, rook at f to d1, adding another piece here, and you know, why didn't the queen just immediately take this pawn as well? So let's see if that would be a problem. It's only been played twice, and it was a 50-50 game, you know, 50-50, black 1-1 and white 1-1. So, I mean, I guess we could take a quick look at that. If they capture here, then they'll capture here. Now this knight is under attack. It looks like queen to d3 is usually played. And then the queen retreats back up. I mean, I guess another possibility would be the rooks to chase the queen. So why, you know, go into all of that? And that's probably why the most played move is just this, adding more pressure to this pawn. Now, rook at f to d8. So we go here and protect. b3 to stop the threat of, you know, that queen being able to take that pawn. But you get the idea. I'll play this out a little bit further just to show you typical moves. The other rook is developed on the half-open file. Looks like the number one move is h3, limiting the scope of the knight and the bishop, also giving the king a little escape square. Now we have h6 being played by black, you know, doing the same, limiting the scope of maybe the queen, giving the king an escape hatch to avoid any back rank mating attacks. Now, what? Bishop to f3. Interesting. Helping fortify this pawn. You know, and taking this knight off of guard duty so it can jump forward. What do we have now? Queen to a5. Putting some pressure on the a pawn, lining up on the queen. And knight to d5 is played the most often. Knight to d5. Normally, we just capture that knight. But what would happen if the queen would take here? So if the queen takes, there's no variations on that. I could look at the analysis. It looks like the best thing here, and white is almost winning after this, is to just capture. So if we capture, they don't even want the knight to be recaptured. Let's see what would happen. We capture there, the queen comes in, you know, causing all sorts of trouble here. So that's why they don't recommend that. So let's go back here. So the top move is to just go ahead and get rid of that knight on that great outpost. And that keeps the game about even. So let me go back here. bishop captures, and this is where you have to decide how to recapture here. Now, of course, the queen cannot capture, or the knight would just take our queen. So this forces us, I guess you have this possibility. The number one move is to trade off knight recapture, so you've gotten rid of the queen. And now you can capture towards the center, like this. And then there'll be a battle down this open c file. So rook to c3, knight up to b4. And why would the knight go here? Well, I guess it prevents the b pawn from pushing forward, or you could go ahead and capture. But the knight has just moved out of the way, and it looks like the most common move is going to be to double up here. And of course, you don't want to allow these doubled rooks. The best thing is to knock one of those out, and then after the recapture, we have rook to d2 covering the second rank, and helping guard this pawn. Wow, knight takes b3 is the most commonly played move. Well, there's only one example, so let's turn on the analysis and see what they think is best. It looks like rook to c1 check is recommended. King would have to run up to h2, and now you have rook where? To c5. Rook to c5. Okay, that allows rook to c2 because that knight is covering that. And looks like g6, or bringing the king into the game. But anyway, this should give you an example of how to play from the opening into the middle game and towards the end game here. All right, let's go back to the beginning here. Take a look at this Kalashnikov variation one more time. So e4, c5. This is the Sicilian defense, and white plays knight to f3 to help push this pawn up to d4. Now, remember, black has different options that they can play here. It looks like e6 is played most often. Then knight to c6 and d6 are about the same. But we're looking at this move, which you'll see quite often because it develops a knight. So now both sides have a pawn and a knight developed. The game continues with d4, the most played move, and it looks like if white wants to try and get an advantage, maybe this is the best way. But the open Sicilian can lead to some crazy games. Just let me know if you play it, if you try it, and what you think of the Sicilian. All right, capture, knocking out one of the central pawns, recapture, and now this immediate e5. Remember to bring the knight forward. Now the knight could retreat back to f3 or b3, but if you're trying to get an advantage with white, then you pretty much have to jump forward. Even jumping to f5 is not as good. Bringing that knight off to the side in that direction, because it's better here having the option to try and jump to d6. Now, of course, actually it recommends knight to f6 to be played here. And then you would do what I mentioned, pinning. But what did we look at? Let me go back to the database here. All right. D6 is probably what you'll see most often. So after this move, you can try the Maroczy bind. Now remember, if you play knight at the first rank here up to c3, then you could transpose into, I believe, the Sveshnikov variation. But if you want to try the Kalashnikov, you probably want to go with this, the Moroxi Bind, which is usually pretty solid if white gets a chance to play that. Let me see what the computer recommends as the top move here. And in fact, the computer does recommend c4, saying that that's the best move to try and get, the biggest advantage, almost half a pawn's worth advantage. But that's the computer. When you're playing a half a pawn advantage, the game's still pretty even at that point. All right, so the Moroxi Bind, playing this pawn up to c4. What else could be played? Well, let's say our opponent plays a little bit slower. Maybe they play the second most played move, bishop to e6. Well, then you want to develop your other knight. And it looks like by far a6 would be played here. And you're thinking, well, I brought that knight up to b5, but then it ends up getting pushed all the way back to the edge of the board. But you have enticed a little bit of a weakness by them pushing this pawn. And the knight will be able to reposition towards the center. So what is most played here? Bishop to e7. So if they play that, another option is rook to c8. So I guess we could take a look at that. And here, the recommendation is bishop to e3, helping cover the center. Now, knight to f6, bishop to e2, preventing pieces from jumping forward here. Bishop to e7, castling by white. The opponent castles as well. Rook towards the center here, getting ready to fight for the half-open c-file and also perhaps help guard this pawn. Now what? Knight to d7, getting out of the way of this queen-bishop battery. And what now? Queen to d2, preventing the bishop to g5 move. So now, knight to c5 can be a common move. Finally, our knight repositions. And what now? f5. So this is something else to look at. Immediately putting pressure on the central pawn. It looks like f3 could be played, but maybe this move is better to attack immediately. Bishop captures. And now the knight jumps up here into the outpost. And what now? Well, bishop to h4 could be played, but I don't know. That doesn't seem like the best move. Knight to e4, jumping onto the outpost. Let's see what the computer recommends. Here the computer recommends the top move as just being knight to h8, getting out of the possible forcing capture of the capturing of the bishop and forking the king and rook here. All right. So what now? Knight to e6 is a common move. But let's say this is played. b4 attacks the knight. Knight up to e4, attacking the queen. Queen to d1. Knight up to f6, putting pressure on that knight in the center. And now knight attacks. Rook steps forward. The knight retreats back, forking. So, I guess you could go for a repetition. But looks like, b5? So this could be a strategy over here on the queen side. If they capture, you capture, and you have a pawn majority on the queen side to try and use in the endgame. But this was an intro video, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I didn't want to go too deep into this opening. It's just a little introduction that shows some of the lines, and you can see if it looks like something that you would be interested in. So, as I said, feel free to leave comments. I enjoy hearing from viewers and subscribers. Like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.